Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to delve into hypnosis, and I'm planning on this being a series. I'm not sure how long it's going to last, but I have more than enough material to go through. And we're going to start with Volume 1, The Nature of Hypnosis and Suggestion, written by Milton Erickson. In other words, these are his collective papers that he worked on from the very beginning of his career, and his career spanned from around 1924 or so, clear until 1980. He was a very prolific and very powerful therapist and hypnotherapist, and he was, as I mentioned in earlier videos, the godfather of all short-term therapeutic interventions. So I hope I'm able to illustrate some of these interventions and show you exactly how he is using hypnosis, or maybe that's a bit ambitious. The guy was a genius, so I don't expect myself to be able to fully be able to illustrate everything he's done, but I think I can share some of the insights that I've gained up through the years. I have worked as a psychologist for 30 years, and now I'm a retired psychologist, and I now call myself a clinical hypnotherapist because I want to do more of what I love. I'm tired of filling out forms and, just following these protocols that psychologists have to follow. So now I'm finally free to focus on what I really love, which is hypnosis. Okay, so let's first define how I view hypnosis, and then we'll compare that definition as we work through the work of Erickson to see if it rhymes or if it's a little bit different. I define hypnosis as a method developed through Western culture, and the goal of hypnosis is to be able to concentrate and focus one's attention on a specific stimuli. In hypnosis, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the person to get into a fairly deep, concentrated state where they can change their mind, they can experience themselves, their reality, in a different and fresh way from how they normally experience life. I don't look, at least for the most part, the people who come to me, I don't consider them to be sick. I'm thinking more in terms of it's a pedagogical process that will allow them to change and change in very fundamental ways. One of the ways I'd like to think about hypnosis is that it's genetic. What I mean by that is that almost everyone, I would say about 95, 97% of the population, maybe even higher, 99%, can go into a hypnotic state. However, not everyone likes to be led by someone else, and that's why you'll see around 10% of people who kind of resist going into the hypnotic state. And you'll have about 80% who are somewhere between the people who go into really deep states, and they'll fall in between these two chairs where this is a very deep, we would call that a somnambulistic trance state. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that word wrong, because I usually just say a deep trance state, and here's a person who's not in a trance state whatsoever. And the interesting thing is that when I changed the idea that there were only a few people who could go into trance, I was able to help many more people. And the reason why I was able to do that is because I tell everyone that it doesn't matter how deep you go when you're going into trance. The whole idea is that trance in and of itself allows you to learn much faster. And if you repeat the messages I'm giving you, you're going to have a tendency to be able to go into this trance state because, in a sense, you're the one leading yourself. That's especially true for the 10% here. The whole thing that I'm trying to illustrate now is that, well, if we're thinking about, and we believe that it's genetic, what's actually going on? Why does it seem to be part of the human condition that we're able to experience deep trance states? Let's just take some common examples as proof. If you've ever watched a movie and you forget time and you forget yourself and you get caught up in the story, well, well, that's a trance state. If you are reading a book and you're just focused on the book, that's a trance state. Just so you're aware, I'm going to include 2 sound files with this video where you can actually test the experimental protocol that Erickson presented in his work in the 1920s. I'm very excited to be able to read that for you, and it'll be interesting to see if it actually works. So if you're someone who chooses to download the file and try it out, go ahead and leave a comment about your experience. Or if you're someone who has actually been in hypnosis, leave a comment. We're defining hypnosis as someone leading you into a trance state. If we agree upon the idea that about 10% do not like to be led, but they can allow themselves to be led if they repeat the hypnotherapist's voice, the messages that they're giving them. I usually like to work with deep states of relaxation because almost everyone who comes to me is very, very stressed. And I'm going to get into this whole idea of stress and how that's influencing us, but not in the most common way. I'm going to approach stress from a fresh and new perspective. That's coming in a later video. Let's get back to the subject that we're talking about, and that is the nature of hypnosis. Why do I believe that it's part of the human condition, that it's even probably part of our genetic makeup? Well, about 50,000 years ago, let's say a space of time about so big, we started developing technology. And around 50,000 years until today, we've gone from arrows and spears and very primitive technology to being able to work metal, fire a rocket up into space, land on the moon, and now we are marching into a world where there's going to be AI. It's a very exciting time to be alive, and I'm very grateful, and I hope that I stay alive long enough to just really see what's happening. This curious mind of mine just never stops. And so this is around 50,000 years ago that this whole technological march we started on began. Before that time, around 250,000 years ago, so you see this gap here between there and there, around 250,000 years, we lived with basically 2 types of technology: fire and stone tools. And that's it. We didn't really develop very much for over 250,000 years. Now imagine what these people did after they had been working all day trying to find food. They would come back to their camp, they would light a campfire, and they'd all sit around the campfire and share stories. I almost ask everyone who comes to my practice where I'm helping them change attitudes and feelings and thoughts if they like or enjoy sitting around the campfire. And I have never met anyone who doesn't like that. So if you're the exception, well, let me know. But the large majority of people really seem to connect with this idea of sitting outside, listening to the flames, watching the fire, and just enjoying the campfire. That to me is very interesting because usually there's a huge variety of what people like and dislike. And I really never met anyone who doesn't really like doing that. And that kind of makes sense if you're thinking about these 250,000 years where our ancestors depended upon fire in order to survive. Not only fire, but also their primitive stone tools and the fact that they could cooperate really well. So that's why I think that when they sat around the campfire, they were telling each other stories. And that's why we love a good story. We love to listen to someone telling a story. We really like to watch a good movie or read a good book. So stories and fire, the light from the fire, is kind of like how we learned to learn, how we managed to get information in very quickly in a very short amount of time. The thing is, though, I'm sure there were initially some people who didn't really find it all that interesting to sit around the campfire and listen to other people's stories. I think those are the people who basically got edited out of the gene pool because they didn't hear where the latest water hole was. They didn't hear about the new animals that were threatening that came into their territory, or the dangerous cannibals over the hill, or whatever. They never got the message about what's going on and what could be very, very dangerous for their survival. And thus, they just didn't continue in the gene pool. That's why I think it's highly likely that hypnosis is part of the human condition. It's a genetic thing. And as I said, I think everyone can be hypnotized. However, there are a few people, around 10%, who don't really respond very well to someone else telling them what to do or how to do it. But if you give them more free rein, well, then we're talking about a whole different story. And I think the paper that I'm going to talk about now shows and points to the evidence that hypnosis is more dependent upon the subject rather than the hypnotherapist or the operator. So that was a big debate around Erickson's time in the 1920s, where they were debating, is there some sort of animalistic power that the hypnotist has over the person, which causes them to go into trance state? Or is there something going on within the person, the subject, which allows them to go into the trance state? As you look through the paper, you'll realize how this kind of work influenced Erickson, because he was very focused on the idea that it was the person's personality combined with their unique interests that allowed them to go into the trance state. Not to say that some people respond better with a more direct authoritarian approach to hypnosis, but that makes sense, doesn't it? Because some people really want to be told what to do. They want to follow other people. And then that would be part of the protocol, in the sense that it is coming from within themselves, the ability to go into the trance state. Hypnosis is a very participatory endeavor. The therapist, the hypnotherapist, invites the person to follow along with the sound of their voice and then makes suggestions that allows them to experience different types of inner realities. And these inner realities, if you understand psychology, you can use to help facilitate change a little bit quicker, or probably much quicker, than if you're following a more traditional therapeutic approach. And that's why I'm always a little bit skeptical too, and also grateful for the scientific method, because the scientific method is trying to standardize an approach to therapy that works for the large majority of people. But it's a statistical method, because there will always be some people who don't profit from it. And then the question is, well, how can we help them? And if some people don't profit from it, maybe there's another protocol that hasn't been developed yet, like combining hypnosis and hypnotherapy with modern psychology, that might help people achieve their goals much, much more quickly. And just notice the fact that I say achieve their goals. So again, I'm not focusing on people who have a disease of any kind. I'm focusing on people who are healthy and who just need a little bit of a nudge, or a little bit of an understanding of how they can change their mind, how they can think differently in order to be more successful in whatever it is they want to become successful in, whether that be maintaining a healthy diet, or losing weight, or quitting some sort of abusive substance. And I think we'll get all into that as well as I go through this series, this in-depth series on hypnosis and hypnotherapy. And of course, I will share some of my work with my clients. Remember, if you're still hanging in there, there will be 2 sound files that you can download that accompany this video, so that you can experiment with yourself and experience the initial protocol that Milton Erickson did for his very first trials in hypnosis. Okay, so let's get into the first trial here. The whole idea that came about when Erickson was designing these experiments was to try to discover whether hypnosis is more dependent upon the subject's inner world, or if it was dependent upon some sort of variable that the therapist, the hypnotist had, which allowed them to go into the trance state. So he developed a very cool and unique way of doing this. What he did was he was at the university and he recruited actually 63 subjects. And what he did is he read for them a script about a fruit bowl and imagining that they were going to lift the fruit up and place it on a table. Now, there was no fruit bowl and there was no table there, and everyone could see that when they walked in. And he positioned himself so he could look through a little peephole and see them both from different angles, because he'd had like mirrors strategically placed in the room. And he would observe their behavior and see what would happen. So imagine this. A student comes in, they sit down, they're read a certain protocol, which again is going to be those sound files that you're going to be able to access here from this video. And he read it to them. Some people wanted to have it read twice or 3 times. And then he asked them to look at the clock, sit down, and then focus on imagining that they would pick up a piece of fruit and move it over to the other table. He was very careful not to mention the word hypnosis, and he was using a term at that time which was very popular called introspection. Introspection was a method used by early psychologists to try to understand what's going on inside of the mind. And so early psychologists were very, very interested in the mental processes going on inside of ourselves. Whereas later in history, like with Skinner and Pavlov, although Skinner came much later than Pavlov, they were more interested in thinking of the mind as like a black box. You really don't know what's going on. And so you would do experiments to try to figure out what are the variables that's affecting behavior. But enough about that. Let's get back to the results. So he had 63 subjects, and 28%, 18 of them just said, I'm out of here. This is just totally boring. It's uninteresting. I don't like this at all. Around 20%, or 13 of them, they became extremely fearful. And they had to stop because they were so scared. So that would mean that around 31 subjects did not complete the task. The interesting thing is that 32 subjects actually did complete the task, and that's around 50%. And the 32 who completed the task, 19% of them went into a deep, deep trance. And he was very good at watching and paying attention to what was going on. And the first thing he noticed was they started losing the blink response. So in other words, they didn't sit there with their eyes closed. They could close their eyes if they wanted to, but they were just intensely imagining this bowl of fruit and that they were going to pick up the fruit and move it over to a table. And as they intensely imagined this, it was quite common if they didn't close their eyes that they'd stop blinking and just kind of, or blink very slowly. Another thing he noticed was that their breathing patterns changed. He doesn't specify how the breathing patterns changed. I'm guessing they probably slowed down, but I'm sure maybe some people got excited and breathed a little bit faster, depending upon whether they... Because you have to remember, this is in the 1920s, so fruit might have not as been available at that time as it is today. So it might have been like a real treat, and especially if you go into deep trance where you think it's real. And that's the whole idea, is right. You're kind of like accessing the mind's ability to do a virtual reality, which is really, really fascinating. The third thing he noticed as the person went deeper into trance is that they lost their swallowing reflex. And that's one of the things that's very prominent when I'm working with people, is I'll see they stop swallowing so much. And then they would develop what we call ideomotor activity or responses. That means he would see twitching, unconscious twitching of like grabbing something or lifting the hand and moving something. And some people would actually move the arms and hands, and other people would just have a feeling, and you could see the body move as if though they were actually doing the task. involved in picking up and moving the fruit. Another thing he noticed that is if they did start moving their arms and moving the fruit, it was very slow movements. So it was not like the typical just picking up and moving over, typical moving over. It was like very slowly reaching over, grabbing the fruit, and putting it on the table. And he would also notice the same thing with the slow movement of the closing of the hand around the fruit. So they were very, very concentrated and focused. And after a while, he would then notice that one of the most interesting things is that he classified deep trance as having complete loss of memory for what they were doing. In other words, when they came back to themselves, they would go, oh, I was just about to get started. Is it done already? They didn't realize that they had done the whole task and then maybe had been sitting there for like an hour, hour and a half. I didn't find any reference to how long they sat there, but I think it was like between an hour and a half and 2 hours. There were actually 19% of the people who could access this deep and very profound trance state. 6 of them even were still in a trance state and didn't really wake up. Because remember, he didn't call this a hypnotic state. He was just asking them to do what they called introspection, imagining. He actually had to escort people out of the room and not say, now you're awake, etc., etc. He just had to kind of like facilitate a natural awakening. And some of them left the room sincerely believing that they had eaten fruit or had moved fruit over from one bowl over to the table. So it's quite interesting. And some of them reported, well, I have this taste of a banana in my mouth, and they thought it was a little strange because if they awakened and saw no table, well, then they'd wonder, well, where did this taste come from? Where other people would actually leave the facilities still in the trance state, having convinced at an unconscious level that they had actually eaten fruit. So that's interesting. Now, he decided he wanted to repeat the experiment. And the interesting thing is he didn't repeat the experiment with the people who were easily hypnotized. No, he accepted the challenge. What can we do with these 31 subjects who either abandoned or were too fearful to follow through? And so he came up with a different experiment, but this time he told them that they would be going into hypnosis. And the idea that they were going to go into hypnosis, this alleviated the fearful people. They kind of like, oh, wow, okay, well, this is different. This is going to be hypnosis. And all he did was put a piece of paper in front of them and a pen, said, now I want you to just look at that paper, and you're going to start to notice that your arm goes up by itself and wants to start writing something. And just allow yourself to become completely engrossed in that behavior, and this will allow you to go into a deep trance. This will be the second file I'm going to read for you, so you can see if you can get this to happen for yourself. What happened, there's one person who didn't come back, so there was not 31, but only 30 people who continued. Of the 30 people who continued, there were, 13 were originally the very fearful group, and 3 of them developed a fairly light trance state. That means they might have just lost blink response and had a little bit of an altering respiratory rhythm, but they did remember. They didn't have amnesia. 7 of them showed more trance qualities in the trance state, and actually around 5 of them developed a very profound and deep trance. That means they didn't remember what had happened. So the interesting thing is the fearful people overcame their fear when they were told that this was hypnosis. And they even remarked, wow, this was very similar to the first experiment we did on introspection. I find this really fascinating because of the people who abandoned the thing because they thought this was just silly, 3 of them actually developed a very deep, deep and profound trance. They had complete amnesia. They forgot what had happened. So even the group that initially didn't seem like they could go in trance, they were able to go into the trance state, which is extremely fascinating. 10 of those people who were in the abandoned group of the now 17 instead of 18, they just gave up. That means that there were 7 altogether, including the 3 who developed a deep trance state. They remained and they continued through. And of the 7, he doesn't specify, but I'm pretty sure some of them could have been categorized in terms of light or medium trance state. What we're seeing here then is that this kind of like blows what traditional psychologists have discovered about hypnosis, where they believe that only about 10% of the population can go into a deep somnambulistic trance state. But here we're seeing a much higher rate of almost 25% of the population. And we're going to see a huge number of people within the medium and light trance states. Type of experiment has implications for why doesn't modern psychology show these same results? Or were the results somehow skewed? Did he make some sort of mistake and modern psychology is actually right? Well, that's the whole point of you downloading those 2 sound files, right? So that you can find out for yourself where you would fall along in this category. And just take heart. If it doesn't work the first time, repeat it. And obviously, since you're listening to this sound file, you're going to know that both these experiments that I'm going to give you will be focused on hypnosis and not the idea that you don't know it's about hypnosis, as Erickson did. So it's not going to be an exact replication of the experiment. But I think it can be a fun experiment for you to do anyway. In my practice, when I work with people, I usually like, as I said earlier, to have people become extremely relaxed when they're going into the hypnotic state. And I believe that's very important because a lot of people come to me and they're very stressed about not being able to sleep, or they have an anxiety. And the stress response always tied to the fear response. And this fear response actually prevents change, because as long as you're fearful, your mind is going to be constantly reorienting towards the stimuli which is causing the fear. If it's something that's not really you need to be fearful of, like for instance, you can't really sleep very well, of course, over time that can be very detrimental. But a lot of times people, if they're like trying to fall asleep, they become fearful that, oh my gosh, the next day is going to be ruined. I can't perform. It's just going to be terrible. And one of the biggest things about hypnosis is you can help people overcome this fear response, and thus it paves the way for being able to learn a new strategy for when they're going to bed at night. I can remember one of the first people I helped with sleep is there came this woman to me, this is over 30 years ago, and she had developed very severe sleep problems. And basically we can divide sleep problems into different types of categories. I just think of 2 very broad categories, not being able to fall asleep or falling asleep and waking up. What happened with this woman was she had been a student. She had been working her behind off for several years, getting good grades and sacrificing sleep. And what happened was her mind became so conditioned to stay awake that she just couldn't sleep when she was finally done with her schooling. I also seen this with people who have children, and the children keep them awake half the night. And I see this all the time with all kinds of different people, shift workers and stuff like that. People who, for some odd reason, their normal circadian rhythm gets kind of out of whack. And our brains are wonderful instruments. They adapt to the environment. And if you're in an environment where you have to stay alert, well, the brain is going to learn to sleep minimally because it thinks it's keeping you alive, right? What I did was I had her relax, and I put her in a deep, calm, relaxed state. And I just told her that she didn't really have to worry about falling asleep. And I told her the more she tried to sleep, the more she wouldn't be able to fall asleep. This is a seemingly paradoxical approach to it because I mirrored her distress of, oh, I want to sleep, I got to sleep. And I told her, well, you have this extreme desire to sleep and you just really are stressed about wanting to fall asleep. And I just mirrored that for a while, allowing her to be able to kind of like say, yes, I can recognize this. Yes, this is a problem. And I did this while I had her imagining she was in bed, tossing and turning and not being able to fall asleep. And I explained to her the next day would be completely ruined because she feared that her whole schooling would have gone down the drain. And I just kind of, mirrored her fear. And then I told her, but there's a simple trick you've forgotten. And that sleep is like breathing. And I noticed a little bit of change in her behavior. She kind of like paid more attention even though she was relaxed and her eyes were closed, but there was some sort of subtle shift. And I said, well, your breathing is something you don't have to consciously control. Now, do you? It just happens by itself. But you can consciously control it if you want. So sleep or going to the bathroom and breathing, these are all examples of the body having the ability to do something automatically. And the thing is, you can't force your body to do something automatically because the more you think about it, the less likely it is your body is just going to do it by itself. So your problem isn't that you can't sleep. Your problem is that you're trying to sleep. And of course, she's in full agreement. But then again, you have to know, well, what is the alternative? Because if you just tell that to someone, they're going to be kind of like stuck. And I said to her, the alternative is to just make everything, before you go to bed at night, make everything easily available for sleep to happen by itself. This was like 30 years ago before we were doing or knew that much about research, or at least I didn't know very much about research about sleep. And now we talk about facilitating sleep. And modern psychology would say in order to facilitate sleep, a good night's sleep starts in the morning when you're going to get sunlight onto your eyes. This kind of sets the circadian rhythm into the right path. As that circadian rhythm gets stimulated by light, of course, you're going to want to facilitate not having strong light about half an hour to an hour before you go to bed at night. I changed the focus from I have to sleep to I can facilitate sleep, and I'm just going to relax. And if I fall asleep, that's fine. If I don't, that's also fine, because it's not something I can do. That's not within my control. What is in my control is the ability to make a good facilitation. That's the clue here. And I managed through hypnosis to help her overcome this huge sleep issue. And I've used that approach with great results with many of the people who've seen me since. And now when people come to me, I'm going to work on even more profound states of altered consciousness through hypnosis to see if there's some other little tweaks there that I haven't thought of. And I'm so looking forward to going through the work of Milton Erickson and becoming inspired or re-inspired by his results and his work. Well, I don't think I need to include a book review today because we did go thoroughly through that article. For those of you who want to read the article yourself, Volume 1, The Nature of Hypnosis and Suggestion. And you'll see that this early work already started to mirror his unique approach to therapy. It's going to be very exciting to see how his therapeutic approach developed as the years passed by, and we have it all documented in those four fantastic volumes. I literally have material for years and years to come just focusing on hypnosis. So maybe I should just niche down the channel and just focus on that for a while. Okay, well that's it for today. Remember to download those 2 sound files and test it out yourself. And drop a comment if you've ever been hypnotized or if you tried it out and it either worked or didn't work for you. Okay, thanks a lot.